Welcome to the Social Landlord podcast, where smart investing meets peace of mind. In each episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the secrets of successful property management. So stay tuned as we reveal what it takes to become a socially responsible and successful landlord. Welcome back to the Social Landlord podcast, where smart investing meets peace of mind. Today we're joined by Paul from Vickers Young Mortgages. Paul, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Nice to be here.
So our relationship started maybe 3 years ago.
About that, yeah.
With the Ministry of Justice contract and a couple of properties that you placed on there. But I want to rewind it a little bit further back. I want to see how you got to where you are today.
Sure.
Because the journey is often as interesting as the path ahead. So we've been doing a little bit of research.
Oh gosh.
I can see that you actually started in Harrods.
Correct.
As an online sales.
Correct. Yeah, no, that was a part-time summer job before I'd say started a real job, so to speak. So I was an online sales executive there. So working down, looking at presents for Christmas and picking up online orders. So it was a really good insight, really discipline and order, because there was a process that you had to go through in order to make sure that those particular products go to the right customers. So
no room for errors.
Oh, there's absolutely no room for errors. I mean, we had some pretty high profile presents that had come on online because those particular gentlemen or ladies couldn't come to the store, so you had to make sure that it was going to the right addresses. And
it's just making me think of Dudley from Harry Potter, screaming about his 27 presents. Yeah. No room for error there. Can't be ruining any Christmases.
Not at all. And
then you've gone from, like you say, from Harrods into some more completely unrelated property jobs.
Yeah.
What was the one? Ice Lolly?
Oh, crikey. So just slightly before that, I was working for quite a high-profile lettings agency. So from the sales of Harrods, I worked for a lettings agent where I was really looking after rental payments and really accountancy. That was my background. I was a property accountant, so ensuring that monies went to the right places, people's rents were paid. Unfortunately, I used to do a few arrears letters and those type of things as well. So when people didn't pay on time,
usually hand in hand with properties.
I know. I was one of those people. So I moved around in that space for probably about 2 years before making the move from London up to Leeds.
And were you in property yourself? I know you were working perhaps with, like you say, accountants.
Not at that particular time, but it was the buzz around the early 2010s. Well, for me, after university anyway. So a lot of people were talking about it, and unfortunately at that time, I didn't really have the knowledge, or I would say the desire, to go down that particular route because I was working in it so excessively. So I moved from there up into to Leeds. And I was working for a commercial property agent over in North Yorkshire. And from there, I felt like I needed a bit of a change. I thought that the industry I'd become a little bit disillusioned with it, quite frankly.
So, how do you feel of the difference between the property market in London at that time and into when you came here? Because there is a high difference, but for someone who's experienced both.
At that particular time in London, it was buoyant because it was just before the 2012 Olympics. So
everyone was putting funding into
so many. The amount of off-plan transactions that were happening at that time was absolutely ridiculous in my personal humble opinion. But things were happening. As soon as I moved up to Leeds, it was a much slower pace. Well, from what I was used to, I think possibly it would have been a higher pace to this particular area, but from what I was used to, not really.
And you said that you wanted a change after that point. Is that when you went to Ice Lolly?
That's correct, yes.
So what did I say to you outside?
What
I said to Fayaaz outside is we were just looking through it. It was accountant, holiday sales, accountant, and I was like, he's got pissed off somewhere in there, and he's just fed up of it, and then he's gone to something else. He's worked there for a little while and thought, this is not for me, I want property, and he's dived straight back into it.
That is exactly my journey.
I could see that outside just from looking at the job trail.
When you came back into property, it's a slightly different role as well than what you had before. It was all accountants.
Correct.
And everything started changing. I was mentioning to Lewis, you can be involved in property, but so many different departments where you could be involved. You just need to find your own niche and where you fit in, and then eventually that's where you find your feet, and then just let things flow.
I would totally agree with you on that. At the time at iSlolly, I was actually starting to invest in property. My late father actually passed at that particular time, and I think I was just looking for a little bit of direction. And it was at that particular time that the property market, especially up in Yorkshire, I became a little bit more illusioned with it. So I bought my first property the previous year, and that gave me the stability than renting at that particular time. And it was then that I thought I would like to move on and try and see what the property market could do for me, to speak. How
old were you at that time?
I was 24.
The price of the property then?
My first property that I bought was for 60,000.
Is this one of your Blackpool ones, or?
Oh no, that comes a little bit later.
Yeah, he saved his Paul Blackpool in my phone. Yeah, okay. And what was that property that you bought? Just a rental, social housing?
No, it was my first residential property at that particular time.
Right, okay.
Yeah, it's not until a little bit later on that I moved down the social aspect.
Right, so something that caught my eye whilst I was going down your LinkedIn and your job history was a company called Foundation.
Correct.
That you'd worked there for over 6.5 years.
Correct, yeah.
Or worked with them, for them.
Worked with them, yeah.
With them. And from doing a bit of research on them, that was a social housing or building better lives for people in a lesser desirable situation.
Correct.
Which is essentially social housing. So
it
is that where social housing perhaps piqued your interest and you realised that there was something else other than your residential buy-to-lets and things like that?
I would say so. I mean, slightly before that, I had started going down the social route inadvertently. There was a managing agent that worked quite extensively with Leeds City Council. So I was inadvertently in it. And around that time, I did a master's in business. I did an MBA. So part of my thesis was where this particular company approached me to do a lettings agency. That was my thesis for Social Landlords, and that's where really it piqued my interest, because I saw another side to it. I think that many of us can have some preconceptions about what social housing actually is, and me actually doing a thesis about social housing
changed your perspective.
Completely changed it.
There's a lot more. We see a lot more care aspect of it to a general landlord. A social housing tenant, someone's going to come trash your house, not going to appreciate what you've given them. But you, from working in that care side of stuff, understood that there is a big need and there's genuine people out there who just need a helping hand.
And that's it.
And as for landlords, that you've experienced yourself, your returns are high as well.
The returns are high, but I think the fundamental aspect is that there is another side.
Of course.
There is most definitely another side. To have some of the people that I have dealt with, that I would say they only need a chance. Yes. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that some of the general conceptions or preconceptions
are not true.
However, the same issues that pertain in the social housing space are also pertain in the private sector and the professional space, so to speak. So you can have a bad tenant in both aspects. It's not discriminatory.
And I think now, especially with new policies and things like that, if you've got a bad tenant in the private sector, it's 10 times more difficult to deal with and address than it is if you've got a bad tenant in the social housing sector.
I totally agree.
Unless your provider's perhaps a little bit iffy, then you're on a different boat. But if you do your DD, then having a sticky tenant in there on a social housing lease is not the end of the world.
Relationships are always easier when it's a B2B relationship. When you're working for private tenants, beyond that one property, there's no other incentive to keep that relationship going. But when you're working with a business-to-business relationship with a provider and you've got 50 to 100 properties with them, both parties, the landlord and the agent, or the agent and the provider, are going to try their best to comply and just settle the issues, because you're not going to fall out over one property when you've got 100 properties going on. So any issues that are there, it easily can be ironed out. Whereas if you've got private tenant, anything that goes wrong is opportunity for anybody to either stop the rent or to be awkward, and it just get difficult.
Yeah.
Managing private sector, it is difficult. Like Lewis just said, there's a lot of laws that are coming in and protecting tenants, so it's only going to get more difficult.
When you were at Foundation, what was your tenant profile? Just general needs?
I would say it was a mixture. So
I think it looked a bit towards disability, more towards physical care.
It was the full spectrum. It was
Right.
the full spectrum. So what
No
I did,
pun intended.
so I actually sat on the board and advised on strategic issues.
Yeah.
Mostly because of my experience as a portfolio landlord.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing was trying to shape policy towards trying to cater to so many needs. And I think that is possibly the most difficult aspect, because there may be somebody that has just come out of the reform of the prison system that needs a different type of care, to a person that has a physical or mental disability that needs a different type of care. And it's really trying to direct the funds accordingly to ensure that all of those people have the same chance or same opportunity to be able to carry on with their life, or in some cases start their life again.
In terms of requirements, for example, you've got clients that have disabilities and you've got clients that have just come out of prison.
Yeah.
How does these requirements work with the councils, and then what type of properties do you examine to know that we're going to put this person in this house, this person in this house, and then somebody, for example, with a wheelchair, I'm assuming if it's a block of flats, they need lifts.
Yeah, correct.
And then if it's somebody who has come out of prison, then you want to be, I don't know, is it closer to home or is it far away? Or
Again, that's a lot of the challenges that we used to face at Foundation. When it comes to the disability, especially a physical disability, I think one of the major aspects that we found was the lack of accommodation, and the lack of accommodation to adapt to those particular needs for that particular person. I think in some cases it's, I wouldn't say easier, it's slightly more adaptable to get a person that has just come out of the reform system to a property, just because it's a singular person.
It's just a
typically.
general
It's a
tenant,
general
other than
tenant.
that.
Yeah, it's slightly easier. Now, trying to find properties that could provide the most amount of care, especially with those, so it's to a key worker, was also going to be increasingly difficult, because again, the misconceptions about what social housing is, about those particular people, you approach a landlord with that type of situation, I would say the vast majority are reluctant to deal with that.
Even nowadays, despite it still being social housing being the buzzword, you know, that's all over social media, I think even nowadays you'll still get landlords. It's probably a 50-50 mix. When you tell them what you do, like, they like the benefits, 5-year lease, guaranteed rent, or guaranteed as it gets as such. Minimal voids.
the first
They
question
like all of that. And then you tell them,
ask is social housing, or is it, what kind of tenants are they?
That's a big question.
My answer to that question, it's a very, very broad question.
It is.
I can't tell you what kind of tenants they are. It depends.
But you know the road that they're going down.
I know the road, so you have to be very careful because you can actually answer it in a way where they're happy because they're contributing to society in terms of helping the more needed, or there's like, I'm too scared to take that risk. So it's a very controversial question how you answer it. I think going back to where I asked what I always wanted to know is, how do you examine what area to put what person in terms of, I know it's a hard question, but in terms of he's got disability, or he's just come up with the reform system, or he's had a rough background who's been referred to us, how do you know where to locate these type of tenants?
I think that with that particular question, it always comes down to need. Now, if you've got the properties in a certain, let's give a good example. If you've got a person that's come out from the reform system and it's around an area of schools, so to speak, that is not typically going to be a place where many landlords or many people would want to be placed. Okay? But if it's a person with a disability, I think you could pretty much put that anywhere as long as the property could be adapted towards their particular need. But then if you've got a person from that system that has extreme need and needs somewhere quickly, you could place them as long as you've got key workers that are around them to be able to keep an eye on them. So it's a difficult question to answer because it really, really comes down to, as you would put it, what they need. And another thing is waiting lists as well. So
I think it contributes massively to their care as well, doesn't it? If they're in an area that's not suitable for them, if they're, in a flat above a shop and they've been convicted of shoplifting,
exactly,
it's not the best place to be putting a tenant.
There you are.
There's a lot of things that goes into before placing a tenant into the ideal house.
Exactly.
And then you get landlords that are, blowing your phone up 3 times a day. I need an answer. Can you take it? Can you take it? And I've only had the property for 36 hours. I need, or the provider needs time to assess if this is a suitable property for their tenant type.
Is that part of like the postcode check and the
that's what it would be.
That's what I'm getting
looking
to,
at that particular postcode. If you've got a person, as we were talking about just there, can they be seamlessly integrated into that society or into that environment? I think is better. It's a better word. Into that environment, can it be done? Do they need an extra element of care in order to ensure that they are able to survive in that particular area?
Once they've stayed in that house for a while with care, when do you know it's time for him to stand on his own 2 feet?
I think that you've got different checkpoints with those particular individuals, and it's typically individuals because it's not usually going to be a couple, but you'd have to gauge that on the way that they respond to the way that you communicate with them. If there's still an element of, I would say, an element of aggression, for example, or still an element of they need an extra bit of care for a particular reason, then you'd be able to gauge it. If they have given you the impression that they're able to cope a little bit better with their situation, that's when you can just start slowly discharging your service towards that particular individual.
I think it's always just a case-by-case basis, isn't it? It just depends on how well they've taken to what you've helped them with. One thing we sort of skipped over that I wanted to sort of have a look into is you worked briefly with Savills for a point.
Correct.
Which is obviously now a massive company, and no doubt back then they were still a massive company. What were you doing with Savills?
It was a commercial property role.
Right.
So I took over a maternity cover in that particular role. It was a good learning curve for me.
And have you worked in commercial property? And I assume Savills was before Foundation, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. So I've worked in 2 commercial property spaces.
So beforehand, if you worked in commercial property and that was sort of where you were geared before, how come you've not invested in commercial as opposed to residential?
That's a very, very good question. I think that my knowledge and my experience with residential property has been a lot more positive. Right. And I think that's the reason, well, in fact, I know that's the reason why I've steered more towards that particular space. Notwithstanding, the commercial space is something that I would probably like to explore, but I felt that I need a little bit more experience dealing with commercial properties.
It's not a beginner entry.
It isn't. You need to have a different element of funding to be able to get into that particular space.
I like how he said funding. Speech marks around it.
Well, that's true, because you do. If you could launch yourself into the commercial space immediately, I think that many would discard the residential space. I think many would, because the returns are more lucrative.
I've sort of, we don't deal with commercial, but obviously over the years I've come across opportunities and things like that I've looked at, and I've always thought the rent on return as opposed to the purchase price of the property was rather high. But there seems to be a lot of opportunity in the commercial as opposed to the private sector now. Private sector is, especially when you come down to social housing, is so oversaturated now. It's so hard to find, unless you have an off-market connection on database of people that will bring you properties before they're on the market. It's so oversaturated. Whereas if you go online and you look for commercial properties, you know, it's 10 to the dozen. There just seems to be hundreds of them.
I'll go back to what I said about the funding aspect. So that's in two elements. That is, the commercial space and commercial mortgages are more expensive to obtain, and the amount of deposits that are typically needed in that space are usually just a little bit more as well. And the third aspect is many lenders like the experience, and many people lack the experience to go straight into that.
Yeah, probably true. Probably true. I can imagine a lot of them would just end up going bust very quickly.
Exactly. You need to have a good element of reserves.
What would be your comparison, your usual mortgage rate, well, your buy-to-let mortgage rate and your commercial mortgage rate?
I think you're looking at typically 1.5 basis points percentages increase
extra
on a commercial. Yeah.
It adds up with a large purchase price as well, I suppose.
It does.
Okay. And obviously from that then, so you've discarded commercial property. We've established it's
I wouldn't say
nothing.
discarded it. I wouldn't say
Set
discarded. I think
it to
that's
the
a bit of a
side.
strong word. I wouldn't say
Set it to the
discarded.
side,
It's on the back burner.
to a later
It's on the
date.
back. I prefer that on the back burner.
Okay, so we've established you've put commercial property on the back burner. You've got yourself a few residential buy-to-lets and things like that. You said you were inadvertently brought into social housing by an agent.
Yes.
Was that by choice, or did he let your property out to a social housing or council without knowledge?
I wouldn't say it was that. I wouldn't say it was without knowledge. I would say that.
But it was still without consent.
It was thrusted on me.
Right. Okay.
But it's been good for me. It's
Yeah.
been very, very good.
So
At that
was that
particular
the point
time,
that piqued your interest then?
yes.
I assume he gave you a good, or you had a good experience with what
I did typically have a good experience.
Don't hear that
There's-
often from people that have gone direct to the council.
He worked alongside the council. I wouldn't say go directly to the council. Now, they have their own little foibles there, which I'm not sure we should go into.
No, probably not.
But he used to work alongside the council
Yeah.
to get those particular properties, which at the particular time, and the reason why it really piqued my interest was the local housing allowance in comparison to the prices that we were
Market
buying at were better at that particular time than the private rented sector. So that was the reason why I put it into. I did my figures. I had a look at the yields that I could obtain from them, and that's the reason why I went down that space.
And what sort of securities did you have back then? Because obviously this is 10, 15.
Yeah, about
However many years
10
ago.
years ago.
So what securities did you get back then? Because now obviously it's no tenant repair costs. Anything done by the tenant is covered. Some will even go further. Any minor repairs up to 250 quid, they cover as well. What were your securities back then?
So we'd have to look at full repair. So if there was anything wrong with the property, we'd have to repair it. As the landlord, you had full responsibility to
Right.
repair the property. However, it was a little bit different then. In 2014, 2015, when I first started investing, you did have the 10% wear and tear allowance that you could use as well. And many of the repairs were offset against your tax. In 2016, George Osborne came in and changed a lot of those aspects. So it was, I would say, a little bit easier to be able to maneuver. And also at that time, you could deduct mortgage interest as well.
Yes.
Again, in 2016, George Osborne came in the Conservative government and changed it. So I think there were differences that made it a little bit easier and made landlords a little bit more open towards a social aspect.
I think leaving the landlord completely liable for the repairs, though, is this where the bad name came from.
Yes. Yeah.
On paper, in black and white, that's your responsibility. So at the end of their 3 year, 5 year, 6 months, whatever contract you've had with them, if that property is absolutely trashed and they don't want to do it, on paper, that's your liability anyway. So.
Well, it was repair with no recourse. So the recourse was you could deduct it from your tax liability. But after 2016...
Still had to spend the money to start with, you know.
True, but I think with every property, you're going to have wear and tear.
Yes. Correct.
You cannot blame a tenant for everything that goes on with a property.
I say to a lot of my clients, your property is like a business. The more you oil it, the more profits it gives you. If you've got a property, you've got a long-term tenant in and you're not decorating it, you're not modernizing it, the rent's never going to go high. It's like if ever you want to sell that property now, it's like if you've got a private tenant who's paying less rent, let's say they're still in time of paying £400 for a one-bedroom flat in Leeds, they're still paying that today. That rent will have a reflection on the price when it comes to selling it. Because for somebody who buys that as an investment, it's not being maintained, it's not being modernized. The rent's not high. That means the purchase price can't be high, so you're not going to get maximum returns because the numbers for an investor won't work.
And they still ask for top COVID prices.
Exactly. So like you say, you have to spend money on it regardless how long it stays there for. It's like a business. The more you oil it, the more profits it gives you. And I think a lot of people just assume bought a property on the side, it's a side hustle, and then they forget about maintaining it.
Well, housing has become a business. That's what it has become. It's a case of the haves and the have-nots now, really. If you don't invest in that particular property, don't expect the returns that you're expecting.
Yes, correct.
Lovely. So I'm going to cut you there. We're going to go for a toilet break. We're going to go get a drink because you've been talking a lot, no doubt your mouth's dry. And we're going to come back for a part 2 and we're going to get a little bit more into what it is that you're doing now. Perhaps some advice that you've got for people and things like that, because obviously mortgages is an ever-changing minefield at the minute, especially for first-time buyers or people that are convinced they don't get mortgages on social housing, things like that. So I just wanted to dedicate the second half of that episode to the bit that people are going to be properly interested in, and then we can go into a bit more detail.
Okay.
Don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you're watching your podcasts. Thank you.